Hello everyone and welcome back. We have been working our way through IFRS 16 leases and so far we have covered some important ground. In today's lecture, we are going to focus on one of the key elements in the definition of a lease contract, that is the identified asset. Now listen carefully my friends, because this concept is an important concept. When we talk about a lease contract, one of the important things that we are looking for is the identified asset. If there is an identified asset in a contract and the right to use of that asset is being transferred, then the contract qualifies as a lease contract under IFRS 16. But what exactly do we mean by an identified asset? IFRS 16 tells us that identification of an asset in a lease contract can be done in two ways. One is explicitly identified and the second one is implicitly identified. Let's break these down. First, let's discuss about explicit identification of an asset. This is a straightforward one. When an asset is explicitly identified, all the details about that assets are clearly mentioned in the contract. For example, if you lease a motor vehicle, the contract might include specific details like the manufacturer, the year of manufacturing, the engine capacity, and the other important specifications. Imagine you are leasing a car and the contract says you are getting a 2024 model Toyota Corolla, red in color, with a 2000cc engine capacity. That's an explicitly identified asset. The asset is clearly described and there is no doubt about which specific car you are getting. Similarly, if you lease a plant and machinery, the contract might include things like production capacity, electricity consumption, and the output quality of the machinery. This level of details tells us that the asset is explicitly identified in the lease contract. Now, let's discuss about implicit identification of an asset. Basically, identification of an asset is not always so direct. Sometimes the asset is not ready yet or it is not fully specified in the contract. This is where the implicit identification comes into play. Let me give you an example. Suppose you want to lease a vehicle or a machinery, but the asset is not available at the moment. Maybe it still needs to be manufactured. In this case, the lessor, for example, a bank or a leasing company, will place an order based on your specifications, things like model, year, color, etc. And once the car is ready, it will be delivered to you. Even though you don't have the asset right away, the specifications are enough to identify the asset. This is called implicit identification. You know you are going to receive a specific car or machinery even though it is not ready yet. So, what's the key takeaway here? The asset in a lease contract can be identified either explicitly, where all the details are clearly mentioned upfront, like a specific vehicle or a specific machinery with particular specifications. Or the asset in a lease contract can be identified implicitly, where the asset is not yet available but will be provided based on the agreed specifications. Both forms of identification, explicit or implicit, mean that there is an identified asset. And that's the key for determining whether the contract qualifies as lease contract under IFRS 16. Are we clear so far, my friends? Great. Let's keep the momentum going. Now, what if the contract involves only a portion of an asset's capacity? Can a portion of the capacity still qualifies as an identified asset? Well, IFRS 16 says yes, but certain conditions must be met. IFRS 16 tells us that the capacity portion can also be considered as an identified asset if one of the following two conditions are met. Either the capacity portion is physically distinct or the contract covers a substantial portion of the capacity. Let me break this down with some example. First, a capacity portion can qualify as an identified asset if it is physically distinct. What does that mean? Let me explain with a simple example. Suppose I own a college with 10 classrooms. A teacher approaches me and says, I would like to rent 2 classrooms for my classes. If I assign him 2 specific classrooms, let's say classroom number 7 and classroom number 8, and designate these classrooms solely for his use, then I have made that portion of my college physically distinct. The teacher knows exactly which classrooms he is getting and no one else is using them. In this case, classroom number 7 and classroom number 8 would be considered identified asset because they are physically distinct. But if the contract does not specify which classrooms the teacher will use, let's say I tell him you can use any 2 classrooms depending upon availability, then the classrooms are not physically distinct. One day he might be using classroom 1 and classroom 2, the next day classroom 5 and classroom number 6. There is no specific portion of the capacity being leased, so this would not count as an identified asset. Now, let's look at the second condition. Even if the portion is not physically distinct, it can be considered as an identified asset if the lessee is using a substantial portion of the asset's capacity. Let's go back to the example of my college with 10 classrooms. If someone rents 9 classrooms, even I don't specifically designate which one they will use, they are still using the 90% of my total capacity, and that's the substantial portion of the asset's capacity. In this case, even though without physical distinction, this capacity portion would be considered as an identified asset. Let's take another real world example, this time with a warehouse. Imagine you are in the import-export business and you need to store your goods in some warehouse. There is a warehouse with 1000 square feet capacity and you rent 200 square feet. Now, if the contract specifies a particular corner of the warehouse, let's say the northeast corner, and it's marked off as yours, this 200 square feet is physically distinct and it qualifies as an identified asset. However, if the contract does not specify which 200 square feet you get, and sometimes you store your goods in one corner, other times in another corner, then the capacity is not physically distinct. In that case, it would not be considered as an identified asset. But if you rent 900 square feet, even if no specific section of the warehouse is marked off for you, that's a substantial portion of the total capacity. And because of this, the 900 square feet would be treated as an identified asset even though it is not physically distinct. So, what we have learned, a capacity portion can be considered an identified asset if it is physically distinct, like a specific classroom or a marked corner of a warehouse, or it represents a substantial portion of the asset's total capacity, like 9 out of 10 classrooms or 90% of the warehouse capacity. That's wrap up the today's discussion on capacity portion and when they can be considered identified asset. I hope this clears up the concept for you all. Alright my friends, let's dive into the final key point for today's discussion. Substitution right and how they affect whether or not a contract qualifies as a lease contract under IFRS 16. According to IFRS 16, if the lessor or supplier has the substantive right to substitute the asset at any point during the lease, the contract does not qualify as a lease contract. Why? Because the asset is no longer considered an identified asset. But here a question arises that what exactly makes a substitution right substantial? IFRS 16 provides us with two important conditions. If both of these conditions are met, the substitution right is substantial and the contract is not a lease contract. Let's take a closer look. Number one, the supplier has the practical ability to substitute the asset throughout the period of use. And number two, the supplier would benefit economically from exercising this substitution right. If both of these conditions are satisfied, the asset is not an identified asset and the contract does not qualify as a lease contract under IFRS 16. Let me walk you through these with some examples to make this concept clearer. Imagine you rent a shop in a shopping mall. The shop you are renting is located on the right corner of the first floor. But the owner of the mall includes a condition in your contract. If we need to run a marketing campaign or meet the customer demand, we may move your shop to the second or the third floor. Now, does the lessor, the owner of the mall, have the practical ability to move your shop? Yes, they can physically move your shop to a different floor whenever needed. Is it economically viable for the lessor to exercise this right? Yes, because moving a shop within the same mall does not incur any significant cost. In this case, the lessor has the substantial substitution right, which means the shop is not an identified asset and this contract would not be considered as a lease contract. Now, let's look at different example. Suppose you rent a 30 kV generator which weighs about 10 tons from a supplier. The supplier says that they can substitute the generator with another one whenever needed. Technically, they have the contractual right to do so. But here the real question is, can the supplier practically replace a 10-ton generator on a regular basis? Not really. It's a big logistical task to move such an heavy asset, and the cost and time involved make it impractical. So while the supplier has the contractual right, it's not a substantial substitution right because it's not practical or economically feasible. And in this case, the generator would be considered an identified asset and the contract would be classified as a lease contract. Let's take a look at another scenario. You run a transport business and you regularly need to move goods from Karachi to Hyderabad. You approach a transportation company and rent 10 trucks to transport your goods on a daily basis. The transportation company agrees but includes a condition. At the end of each day, we will take the trucks back to our warehouse and if necessary, we may substitute them with different trucks. Now, can the transportation company practically substitute the truck? Yes, because the trucks returns to their warehouse every day and it's easy for them to swap one truck for another. Then, would the transportation company benefit economically from this? Yes, because the swapping the truck does not involve significant cost and it helps them manage their fleet efficiently. Since both the conditions are met, the substitution right is substantial and the contract would not qualify as a lease contract. Finally, consider a scenario where you rent a plant and machinery and the contract states that the supplier will take the machinery every few months for maintenance like oiling or minor repairs. In this case, the substitution right is not substantial because it's part of a regular maintenance, not a full replacement of the asset. Here the asset remains an identified asset and the contract would be classified as a lease contract. Okay, now you might be wondering, what if you cannot tell if the substitution right is substantial or not? In such case, IFRS 16 provides a final safeguard. If you cannot determine from the contract whether the substitution right is substantial or not, you should assume that the substitution right is not substantial. In such cases, the asset would be considered identified and the contract would be treated as a lease contract. Let's sum it up. Today, we learned about the concept of identified asset. I hope everything is clear so far. With that, we will wrap up today's lecture. Thank you for your attention and I will see you in the next session, where we will dive deeper into more terms and conditions under IFRS 16. Thank you.